Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Spellbinders sent me a bunch of their items in the new Mirrored Arch collections, and today I'm going to do some partial die cutting. And mostly I'm going to use these Mirrored Arch labeled dies to create unique card fronts, but I'm also, for the first card, going to use this Luxe backdrop and border embossing folder. It's a really cool embossing folder. It's got two different textures within the same folder, but the end of the folder has a border as well as a die in it. So we're going to use that to create a unique card front with that embossing folder and the die cut that it creates over the side. So I'm running it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 using the stacking for an embossing folder. And I did do it a couple times just to really get that embossed image pressed right in there, and I did mist my cardstock ahead of time as well. And look at that beautiful embossed card front that it creates with a really nice die cut edge. So now we're going to use the Mirrored Arch labels dies, and I'm going to do some partial die cutting in a couple different ways to create some interesting card bases. So I have just an A2 card folded on the side here, and I am making sure that that fold is just inside the blade or the die part of my die. I'm using some Spellbinders yellow tape to tape it in place, and I have it so that the blade goes right up to the top of that card, and I'm only going to be die cutting that top arch there. I just want to create a unique top to my card front, and it's really easy to do when you're putting it through your machine. Rather than putting that top plate over the entire die, I'm only putting it over the top part of that die cut, the part that I really want to do the die cutting in. Now these cutting plates have a little bit of a beveled edge, so the thickest part of that beveled edge is what I put to the end of where I want to stop die cutting. And I'm using accent opaque cardstock for my card base, so it's a really nice thick cardstock. So I'm trying to die cut through two layers. And the first time I had the blade side down, but I did find with the blade side facing up that it die cut a lot better. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, though, is when you can see one of my plates here is really die cut into, a lot of that texture is going to transfer to the card. So if you want a card front that doesn't have that texture to it, I would recommend using some newer plates that don't have all of that in there. So I'm going to create another card base here with that same Mirrored Arch label die set. I'm going to do 3 different versions of a card front with it, just to show a few different ways to use it. Now this is the largest of that Mirrored Arch labels dies, and the outside blade for the two sides is about 4 1/4, and then the top and the bottom of that arch is about 5 1/2. So it's the perfect die to do this on a card front. So once again, I placed my die on my card base where I wanted those edges to cut. I had the side edge just inside the blade, and I'm really only cutting about through half of my card to create that side that has the arch on the top as well as on the bottom. And then the fold part of the card is just like a normal card. Once again, just a unique way to use a die to create a different shaped base. This particular card can be used horizontally or vertically. And now I'm going to make a horizontal one. So for this one, it would be a top folding 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card. I'm taping my die in place, and I'm going to use this as a horizontal card. It's going to be long with just those curves on the open edge. So once again, I placed my die in place, taped it where I wanted it to go, and I would recommend for this technique to tape your die in place just to make sure that it's not going to shift on you while you're die cutting. There's enough to pay attention to when you're trying to have that plate placed properly to make sure that it only die cuts the part of the die that you want it to die cut. And by having your paper taped in place, it just helps. And you can see that I do have a struggle a little bit putting it through my machine, and that's only because I'm putting it all the way through, and then there's just a tiny little bit that it has to go over with the end of the plate. So it just takes a bit to get it over that little hump there. If by chance you have an instance like this where there's just a hair that didn't cut, you can use your scissors and just die cut it. And with that one die from the set, we got 3 different unique card bases. And it's just a different variation from a regular square or rectangle card. This one you definitely could only do horizontally because that curve, it can't actually sit on that curve. Now let's go and decorate our card bases. So we've got the first one here that we have embossed, and I am taking the Mother's Day and Father's Day Better Press plates, and I'm going to use some purple cardstock. I'm taping it in place. I'm only going to be using the Mother's Day sentiment for this, but because they are both on one plate, we're going to do all of them together. Highly doubt I'll be using the Father's Day with this color background, but you never know. I'll put it aside for future projects. I'm using some Versamark ink, and then I'm also using an embossing powder tool on my cardstock just to make sure that my embossing powder only sticks to where I want it to stick. Once I have my press plate inked and my paper powdered with that embossing powder tool, I put the clear plate on the base and put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. And here I have that Versamark ink transferred over. I'm just using some white cardstock. White embossing powder. It's going to coordinate nicely with that white cardstock base. And I happen to have a few fluffy things in my embossing powder, so you want to make sure to take that out before you melt anything. And I'm using my heat tool to melt everything, and I get a nice bright white, despite the fact that that embossing powder looks a little bit off-white. Now, some of the thicker parts of this plate, I noticed it didn't transfer a whole lot of ink. So the easiest fix for this is an embossing pen. I just have a Distress embossing pen here. Versamark also makes one, and you can just color in the areas that you want some more powder on, and then that powder will stick to wherever you colored with that pen, and then you can melt that again and have some perfect sentiments. I love the fact that this sentiment set has a coordinating die with it, so you can put that onto your finished sentiments here, tape it in place, and then run it through your die cutting machine to cut all of those pieces. For these sentiments, I definitely recommend having the blade side down, and I typically don't die cut like this, but I do find that it helps those sentiments cut more proper, which I know is not good English, but I find that if you have the blade side up, which is how I usually die cut, that paper kind of shifts and moves as you're die cutting, and you end up having not perfectly die cut sentiments. So just a little tip, if you want to die cut sentiments, they do tend to not shift if you have the die on the top with the blade facing down. So in order to have my embossed image here coordinate with the purple cardstock, I chose to use some Distress ink, and this is milled lavender. I'm using a detailed embossing or detailed ink blending brush, and I'm just adding just a touch of ink to this embossed image. The embossed image itself is just so gorgeous that it doesn't really need a whole lot, but I did want to highlight those flowers, and I also wanted to coordinate my sentiment as well as my colored insert. And the colored insert in the inside of the card, the main purpose of it is so that you can really see that beautiful embossed and die cut edge of the card, and it really highlights that. My ink pad is really quite dry, which I really like for this because I only want a touch of ink. I don't want a whole lot of color here, and by having a fairly dry ink pad, I can control it a little bit better. If by chance you have an ink pad that's not dry, you can easily take your ink blending brush, dip it in your pad, and then take some ink off on a piece of scrap paper. That way you can dry out the color of your brush, and you can really control how much ink you're getting on there. It's always easier to add more ink. You can't take it away. Once I have as much ink in there as I want, I'm using my Barely Art glue in the fine tipped bottle, and I'm gluing that colored insert in there, and then I'm going to glue the sentiment onto the front of the card. I am using a Simon Says stamp T ruler in order to make sure that I have that sentiment placed right and it's nice and straight on the front of my card, and this just makes it really easy, takes any of the guesswork out of it. Because that right edge is die cut and not straight, as well as the fact that I have the embossing there, it just makes it a little bit easier to know that it's placed properly. The last step after that glue is dried is I'm just adding a little bit of stickles to the centers of those flowers. It's just going to add a touch of sparkle that will shine when you tilt it and it hits the light. And once that's dry, our card is complete. And really, this card, for how much embossed detail there is on there, it was really, really quite simple. You just had to put the card base through there, add the insert, and then add the sentiment, and it would work for many different occasions. So now let's take the second card and we're going to decorate it. So I have some gold mirror cardstock that I'm going to use that will work lovely with this purple cardstock that I'm going to use for some of the mats as well. I'm using the Mirrored Arch Nested Sprigs Better Press Plate set, and I have this purple cardstock that I have taped to the front. I'm using some embossing powder tool on it to make sure that my embossing powder only sticks where I want to, and then I'm inking those plates with a Versamark pad. I will put the clear plate onto the base, run it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine, and then I'm going to add some gold embossing powder to tie in with that gold mirror cardstock that I'm going to be using. And the gold and purple make a lovely combination, and this dark purple with that gold is just beautiful. So pour my powder on there, and I always do this over top of a scrap piece of paper. That way any of the excess that comes off of there can get put right back into the bottle and there's no waste. Use my heat tool to melt that powder in place, and then I'm going to use that Mirrored Arch label die set again in several different sizes and cut out some different layers for this set. I love that I think there's 16 different ones or different sizes in the label die set, so there is a lot of sizes to choose from, and it's perfect paired with these Mirrored Arch Better Press plate sets. Great way to get lots of layers, and you can even get some faux layers in here, and you'll see that for some of my cards I layer things up, and for some of them I kind of cut out layers so that it looks more layered than it actually is. And that's a great trick that you can do with these mirrored with nesting sets that have so many different sizes, is you really have the control and you can be really creative with it. So I'm going to get several different sizes, use them on my purple Better Press embossed piece, and I'm also using several different sizes on my mirror cardstock. And because those inside bits are only going to be hidden by layers above it, we might as well use different dies and cut those pieces out and utilize our specialty cardstock as best as possible. And using some tape on here makes it really easy to make sure that those dies stay in place and they are evenly spaced while you're die cutting. I like using the yellow tape from Spellbinders for this because it's really, really nice and thin, and it can be used multiple times. So you'll see me using it over and over again throughout this video, and I just reuse those pieces until they don't really have a lot of stick to them, and then I'll just toss them away. So you can get a lot of use out of them. Run them through the Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine to die cut those pieces. And that mirrored cardstock die cuts just as beautifully as just regular plain old cardstock. So you don't need anything special to die cut some of the specialty papers, but it just adds a beautiful shine and a beautiful different texture basically to your cards. So I will take my pieces out of my die cut and glue them on, and I'll use that same Barely Art glue. I like it in this fine tip bottle because I can control exactly how much glue I put on there. While my glue is kind of drying and starting to set, I'll put an acrylic block on there just to hold everything in place. That way it frees up my hands to work on my next layer or my next part of the card. So this piece here is going to go underneath the piece that I have under my acrylic block. So I'm just putting that glue on the center part and then putting that piece on top of there. And you can see how I got those extra layers with that center part that I had already glued on there. It makes it look like there's so much more dimension than it is, but it keeps the weight of that layer down, as well as making sure to get as much as possible out of your cardstock. Put that onto the front of the card, and I just didn't cover enough of that card background. So I grabbed the piece of cardstock that I better pressed that image on, cut another layer to put below it. And you can see that I got all of the look of all of these layers with just a small piece of mirror cardstock, as well as a small piece of purple cardstock. Once again, the best way to get as much use out of your cardstock as possible. And this is also a great tip if you have a color that you love that you're not able to get again and you want to get as much use of it as possible. This is a perfect way to do that. Once I have all of my layers together, I can glue that onto the front of my card and then put that acrylic block on there to hold it down for a few moments while that glue starts to set. And it really only takes a few minutes. It doesn't take that long. Now you could leave that card base as is with the nested arches and the label dies, and it would be beautiful. I thought it would be really nice with some flowers around the edge of that border. So I have this Be Bold Blooms die set. I have a bunch of white die cuts that I did at one point, and I'm taking a detail blending brush and using some Wilted Violet Distress ink and just basically inking my brush and then kind of flicking it out. I want some of that white to be showing through. To tie in the purple from my layers as well as the white from the card base to tie everything all together. And this is the easiest way to do it, and it's really easy to color these die cuts whatever color you want. I have a couple different flowers from the set, and then I'm also going to take the center of the flower dies as well as some leafy sprigs, cut them out of a piece of the gold mirror, and this is going to be the piece of gold mirror that is from the center part of what I die cut. Might as well use as much of that up as possible. Once again, I'm going to be taping those dies in place just to make sure that I utilize as much space as possible, as well as making sure that nothing shifts on me. Once those are die cut, I can glue those centers onto the flowers, and then I can start gluing them onto the front of my card. Now, anytime I'm using flowers, I like to use my fingers to, especially the larger flowers with the bigger petals, I like to use my fingers to kind of curve those flowers, give them a little bit of shape. It just adds extra dimension to your card, and it really only takes a few seconds. The smaller flowers, it's a little bit harder to do, but you can get a little bit of curving in those petals. Like I said, it just gives them a little bit more life, gives them a little bit more shape, and in my opinion, it makes them look a little bit more interesting. So anytime I'm adding flowers or kind of florals to the front of our card, I lay everything down first just to make sure that I know exactly where I want everything to go. Much easier to do this ahead of time than waiting until you have wet glue and need to move things around or rearrange things. So I put that big flower there because it's the thing that takes up the most space. That way I can easily space my greenery, which is gold, and then the smaller flowers. Using that Barely Art glue again to glue everything in place. And that way, if I do happen to need to shift anything, I do have a few minutes to do that. And I don't have to worry about things being permanent and having to rip them off. With all of those things glued down, I can let that completely dry, and here is the completed card. And really a very, very simple design, but it's just elevated by that gold embossing as well as the gold layers from the mirrored arch label dies. I'm going to create a second card. This time I'm going to use some holographic paper with some purple cardstock. I'm using the same mirrored arch nested sprigs Better Press plates, and I'm going to do several different layers, and I'm going to use it with the Better Press ink. This is perfect for on non-porous paper, which is what the gold mirror or the holographic cardstock is. It almost has like a plastic coating on it. So it will take a little bit longer to dry than just regular cardstock. So I like to put it through the Better Press and the Platinum 6 machine and then give it some time to dry. And I just went and did some other things around the house while I let that dry. I know that I won't be using the parts on the outer four corners of this image. So the way I tested to make sure that my ink was dry is after a while I came back and I just rubbed those outer edges that I knew I wasn't going to use, just to make sure that everything was dry and nothing was going to smear while die cutting or gluing it down. So I have a few different sizes of the mirrored arch labels dies that I'm using, and once again I'm taping them in place to make sure that I have my layers as evenly spaced as possible and to make sure that nothing is going to shift in my die cutting machine. Any of the pieces that I'm not using for this card, I'm going to be using for my next card, so it's not going to go to waste at all. And it's a great way to get as much use again out of that cardstock as possible. Once everything is die cut, I can glue my layers together, and you can see how just that little bit of metallic adds the perfect amount of Like, it just brightens everything up. I love the reflectiveness of it on these layers. And I also love the fact that this holographic one has a bit of rainbow colors to it. So it just ties in perfectly with that purple, and it would tie in with many different colors as well. For these first two cards, I have vertical cards here, but you could make them horizontal if you wanted. Once I have all of those layers glued together, I'll put them onto the card base. And once again, I'm going to embellish this card with some florals. Again, you could leave it like this and have it very, very simple. I just like the florals on top of it. I think it adds some extra dimension, a little bit of extra interest. I just like them. So I noticed when I was looking at my spare piece here, that I had a little bit of extra border that I could use. So I just put that to the side and then grabbed some of the white die cuts that I have in order to ink those to put onto the back of this card. Now, I at one point went to a retreat and I just spent a bunch of time using my die cutting machine with this die set and cardstock scraps and just die cut a ton of them. It makes it really, really handy to have little bags of these to just grab and go and pick up where you left off. I keep these bags right with that die set because I know if I'm ever wanting to use that die set, it's handy to have these die cuts there ready to use. Great way to use up some cardstock scraps, as well as the fact that if you're not feeling super creative, it's a great way to just kind of do some ahead of time prep. That way, on a time or at a time that you are feeling creative, you can get a lot of stuff done at once, and you'll be thankful to have all this stuff pre-die cut for yourself. So I'm using a few green die cuts here. I also have some holographic greenery die cuts that I'm going to use as well. Off camera, I inked my flowers the same way I did for the last cards. And then I also die cut centers out of that holographic cardstock to put in the center of the flowers. So all of the metallic in this card coordinates with each other. Having the little bit of holographic greenery on top of the green looks really, really pretty. I really liked the way those two looked. I'm using the same die cuts as I used on the last card, but for the next one, I'm going to use some different ones. I do my Barely Art glue. I glue these down with Barely Art glue, and you'll notice that I don't really glue the ends of them down. I glue pretty much everything up until the end of those die cuts. You can glue them down if you want, if it makes it feel a little bit more secure. I don't really worry too much about it because there's a lot of dimension here. I don't think a whole lot of things are going to get caught on anything, but if you feel more comfortable, you can absolutely put more glue on there and glue them completely flat. I like the extra dimension that it gives when you don't. So I'm going to glue the centers of those flowers, and I also curved them with my fingers just to give them a little bit of dimension here. And once I have the center of that flower down, I do hold that center one in place just because my acrylic block would flatten my flowers and I want to keep them as dimensional as possible. In order to add a bit of a different texture to the centers of these flowers, I use some glossy accents right over that holographic cardstock. It just gives it a slightly different look. It still coordinates it really, really well, but it adds an all over glossy texture to it and fills in the little holes in that die cut. Once that is completely dry, I set that aside and went to work on my horizontal card here. So for this one, I'm going to use the sentiment from the Mirrored Arch Blooms Better Press plate set. So I want to have this horizontally on my horizontal card. I started putting my cardstock on my Better Press and then realized that this cardstock that I'm using, it's from Basil, and it has a little bit of texture to it, and the texture is directional. So you'll see I changed the direction of my cardstock, and that is the reason. You can't actually see the texture on screen, but if you were wondering why I was doing that, that is the reason for that. I'm taking some Villainous Potion Distress ink and inking up my plate. I wanted to have a bit of a different color from the other two cards, so I used the purple, and that nice dark Villainous Potion purple works perfectly on this medium shade of purple cardstock here. Put that through my machine, and then I'm going to take one of those Mirrored Arch Labels dies and die cut that to go in the center of my layers from the rest of my card. The other layers I already have die cut from a variety of purples, as well as the leftover holographic better pressed paper from my last card. So I've got that all ready to go. and just need to glue up all of those layers together. Now, I tend to glue my focal point off of my card and then put it onto the card at the end. You could absolutely glue them right to your card if you wanted. This particular one, my largest size, I know it's big enough and it's going to cover enough white, so there's no reason to do that. With the first couple cards, when I had some smaller layers, it was easier to see if I liked those layers by having them glued separately and then just placing them on the card. And you could see with the one that I did find it needed to cover a little bit more area, so I ended up adding that extra layer, and it was easy enough to do when it was off of the card. Couldn't really do that if that was on the card, other than starting over and ripping those layers off. So once I have everything glued together, I can put that onto the front of my card. And I am going to put some florals on this card as well, but I'm going to do them differently than the last card. I really like the flowers that I'm using for the last card, so it's not because I don't like them. I'm just trying to change it up a little bit. So put these base layers down, and then I took some of the Be Bold Blooms dies and I cut those same purple colors out of using some of those flower dies, gluing them together just to tie in the different purples that I have in these layers here. And once again, I just use those dies to cut out from some of the scraps from the different layers that I've been cutting throughout this class. So again, great way to use up extra little pieces of cardstock. A lot of the dies in sets like these are fairly tiny, so it's a great way to use up those little bits and pieces and coordinate and tie everything together. I'm dry placing everything on my card just to make sure that I know where I want everything to go before I start to glue anything down. Once I have my idea planned in my head, I start to put the glue down. I just placed my big flowers. I know where I want that greenery to go. I want it to kind of go behind and in front of those florals. But those flowers that I just pieced together are kind of the biggest thing here. So I wanted to make sure that I left enough space for them. And then I'm going to put that same floral that I've been using for the last couple cards in the center of this arrangement, but I have it die cut from colored cardstock, and I'm not ink blending that one. Once again, using that Barely Art glue. For a lot of these florals, I don't really put that acrylic block on there to hold it down. There's enough glue on there to hold it down. But after layering several pieces together, I will start to put that block down just because the layers get a little bit raised, and I want to make sure that those pieces have really good contact with the glue, and make sure that they're held down while I have my hand busy putting glue on a new piece. You could hold it down with your fingers as well. This just frees up your hand to keep working, and it's always nice to do dual duty. Now I'm using the Be Bold Blooms die set for all of these florals. There are so many different floral die sets out there. Obviously this would work for any floral die set, or you could leave it off if you wanted, or you could have just one focal floral or just one little element. I love the fact that with these dies and with the sentiment in the center, you can really get creative with how you decorate them. I tend to, when I'm working on a video, make sure that the cards kind of coordinate together or have some central theme. So that's why I did them all with purples, and then I did basically the same floral set throughout the video, so they're all going to coordinate together. So for the center of that large flower, on top of that holographic center, I just added some dots of stickles. Again, it's going to add a little bit of a different texture. And I love these other florals with that large flower as well. So for my last project, we're not making a card. I looked at the shape of this die set and thought it would be really cool for a pillow box. So we're going to try this out here. I have an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and I'm scoring it down the center at 4 1/4. And because this die set, the outside part of the die is 4 1/4, those blades will go on the outside part of this folded piece of cardstock here. So I have that fold in place, and I made sure to use my bone folder on it and make sure that it was really nicely folded, basically. I'm taking the edge of that die and I'm going to put it on the end of this cardstock, tape it in place, make sure that I have everything where I want it to be. And once again, taping in place to make sure that that die does not move. I'm going to use the full length of this cardstock. It does make a long pillow box, so you can use a shorter piece. And I'll tell you right away, using a piece that is only 5.5 inches long, so half a sheet, it was not long enough. You can, the center of the pillow box is like maybe an inch. So you do need a longer piece than just a half a sheet of cardstock. But you'll notice when I have this piece or this pillow box done that it makes quite a long pillow box here. I'm going to repeat that process on the other side, taping this in place. Now, for die cutting, it's exactly the same as when I die cut my card bases. We're just using a longer piece of cardstock here. So once again, I have that taped in place. I'm putting the thick edge of the bevel of my cutting plate where I want my machine to stop die cutting. And then I can take that piece off there. And I've got a long piece there that I've die cut both edges to. Now I'm going to take that same die and I'm going to place it in the opposite way on the ends of my die, and I'm making sure that the corner of my die cut edge of my card matches the corner on the die there. And once again, taping everything in place. This time we're going to use the stacking on the machine for embossing a die cut. So I love that the Platinum 6 has a universal plate system. Everything is very clearly labeled, so it's really easy to know exactly which plates you need to use for this. So I'm going to use the stacking for embossing a die cut, and I'll be using the rubber mat as well as the embossing plate with those base plates there. Once again, want to make sure to tape all of these pieces in place before the embossing. That cardstock piece is fairly long and it would easily move wrong. So by taping it in place, I can make sure that that stays correct while I'm playing around and moving the stacking for my die cut here. I can put this all the way through the machine because I'm just embossing the curve of that die on there, so I don't have to worry about having an edge or something that gets imprinted on there. It's not going to happen. It's just the curve of that die that we're trying to emboss in there. So I'm going to do that same thing on the other side of my die cut piece here. Put it through the machine exactly the same way as the first one. And when I do this embossing, it embosses both sides of this at one time, so I don't need to do this 4 times. I can take that piece off of there. Now you could do this same technique with some of the smaller dies in this set. This one is using the largest die in the set. And then at this point, if you wanted, you could take one of the dies in the set and cut a window out of your base here. The one thing you want to keep in mind is the only way to do this is to fold it the opposite way to get it through your machine, and it is going to leave an impression of that die in the back side of your pillow box here. So it is possible to do it. You just want to keep in mind that it's going to leave an impression of that die there. But it would be a neat way to put a window in the front of your pillow box. I have a scrap piece of cardstock here that I just cut to the length of those tips of my pillow box. I'm using a bone folder to score that in half, and then I am folding that in half. This is going to glue those two sides that are open together. Make sure that that is folded really, really well. And then I'm taking some nice strong double-sided tape and I'm going to put it on both sides of that folded piece there, close to my folded edge. Before I do that though, I'm just marking, because my scored edge is curved, I'm just marking where that curve is, and I'm just going to cut those pieces out with scissors. You could use the die, but this is a piece of cardstock that doesn't get seen, so it doesn't need to look pretty. It just needs to make sure to hold those two edges in place. And by putting this tape as close to that folded line as possible, it's going to help keep that area closed. The tape that I'm using here is 7 millimeters, which I think is about 3/8 of an inch. You can use thinner tape if you want, but I wanted to make sure that it held it as good as possible. So once I have that tape on there, I fold or I press it down to make sure that it has good contact with the cardstock. Take one of those lengths off, put it on your pillow box base, and then take the backing off of the other one and put that on the pillow box base. And there we have our pillow box. Really quite easy to make, especially once you know how to do that. Then you can fold in the edges and you can put in whatever you want to them. I realized that I didn't have my two flaps going the same way, so I had an opening on one side. So I am redoing that here. Now this looks rather plain, but you could use pattern paper to create this, or you could stamp on something, or if you wanted to put that window in the front, you could have that there. I just wanted to show you that you could use these dies for not a card, for something that was 3D in a different way. So I'm going to create a little bit of a note card to go with it. I'm using one of the smaller of the Mirrored Arch label dies, and I have a piece of folded purple cardstock here, putting that through the machine, and I have just a really cute little gift card here to tie onto there. I am not good at decorating things. I'm good at making cards, but I'm not good at decorating gifts and stuff like that. This is not my forte, so I'm trying here, but it's not going to be anything earth-shattering. I have a piece of ribbon here that I'm going to go around my pillow box, and then I'm going to tie that gift card in place. Off screen, I decorated it with some floral die cuts as well as a little just greenery sprig. I'm going to do a double knot on this ribbon on the pillow box and then put it through the hole in that gift card. You could make this as fancy or as simple as you want, but it's always nice to have a little bit of decoration on there. And there we have our finished gift box. Little gift card there you can write in. You could make it more elaborate if you wanted to, but great way to use that die set for something that is really non-traditional. Here is our fourth card. We made so many cards, I didn't even know how many we have. So that is the fourth card. The three cards, the second, third, and fourth card, they're all very similar to each other. Just kind of different variations. And the main thing is that the card base is a non-traditional shape. It's always neat to have something a little bit unexpected. And by having a non-traditional shape for your cards, it's a great way to do that. And then finally, we have our embossed card with the die cut edge. And I absolutely love how quick and easy that card is to put together, but it has a lot of impressive texture to it. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you being here. Have a fantastic day.